Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Greenwich Library's Date with an Author. My name is Sharbri Ahmed, and tonight my guest is novelist Avni Doshi. Um, now, Avni is an American novelist currently based in Dubai. She was born in New Jersey to immigrants from India. She received a BA in art history from Barnard College in New York and a master's degree in history of art from the University of College London. Her debut novel, which we'll be discussing tonight, uh, Girl in White Cotton, was published in India in 2019. In 2020, it was published in the United States under the title Burnt Sugar by Overlook Press. The novel has been shortlisted for the 2020 Booker Prize and now longlisted for the Women's Prize in Fiction. Or short. When do you find out about the shortlist?
Um, I think at the end of the month. I think it's the 28th of April.
It's coming up. It's coming
yeah,
up.
make the announcement.
Incredible. So this program is co-sponsored by Greenwich Library and India Cultural Center. India Cultural Center is a nonprofit organization with a mission to foster inclusion by educating and engaging the community in Indian culture. ICC thanks Greenwich Library for partnering with it and showcasing the literary talents of the Indian American community. So thank you so much, Avni, for joining me. As we were discussing before we started the interview, Avni and I first met in 2019 at a literary festival in New Delhi that was so interesting. Remember you were on stage and there was like a wacky exchange between another guest, and you were trying so hard to just not burst into laughter. I remember you were poised and graceful, and we became friends as a result. And I'm so thrilled to be talking to you about this novel, which I inhaled. And it's not an easy novel, Burnt Sugar. It's not easy. It's painful, but in a good way. So the first question that popped into my head is, where did the nugget or seed of this story come from? Because it is a complex story and unexpected.
Yeah. So it was just a really long time ago now. I remember I was in my grandmother's apartment in Pune, where the novel is actually set, in Pune, India. And I remember I was sitting on this little balcony she has where they actually dry the clothes. And I was just trying to get some fresh air, I guess. And it's just strange the way the image came to me. I think there was like a kind of some kind of dapple or some kind of issue with the glass that was on the balcony, and I could see through it, and it was sort of splitting my vision in two, and that image of this bisected vision turned into this image of a face that was cut in two, and that became a sort of image of a mother-daughter. And it just sort of started to progress from there. I think it was almost something that was in me internally, but it was triggered by something I saw externally, if that makes sense. And before I knew it, I was kind of envisioning these characters almost sitting on that same balcony having a conversation. And I remember, I think it was the mother character, she was smoking a cigarette and her daughter was kind of looking on disapprovingly. And as I was kind of picturing this scene, the characters of mother-daughter, they kind of started to switch. I was imagining the dialogue between the two characters, but I kept confusing in a way, or there was kind of a blurriness or a kind of, there was something unclear in terms of who was actually the mother and who was the daughter, if that makes sense.
Yes, of course.
So that's really where the absolute beginning was in terms of the draft that was finally published.
Yes.
That happened many years later. I think it was 7 years. I think I had gone through 8 drafts at that point. And I couldn't find, I knew the story I wanted to tell. I knew the kind of story I wanted to tell, but I couldn't find my way in. And I had experimented with different voices. I had experimented with tenses. I had experimented with different sections of the story. I remember that one of the drafts was actually like a partition story around the grandparents. So it was like more about it started and really kind of focused on the grandparents' generation and their entire narrative. And after every draft, I was so frustrated, and I just started to feel like, what am I doing? I'm never going to be able to finish this. And when I sat down to write this draft, Antara's voice, as it is in the novel, kind of popped into my head, and it was so clear and so strong and so arresting that I couldn't help but kind of follow it. And she, in the beginning, she seemed almost like an unlikely narrator for the story, because I found her immediately unreliable, immediately kind of troubling in certain ways.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, I was just completely compelled. So I think that, the minute I heard her voice, I had a lot of mixed feelings, but I realized that having those kind of mixed feelings is probably a good sign. And so I kind of dove in from there. And at some point, I really felt like, wow, she's in the room with me and she's talking to me. And so finding Antara's voice was really, for me, like the essential kind of moment where I knew that this is the way I'm going to get kind of carried to the end of this journey.
So you've answered a bunch of my questions in this. Like, when did it start? And I think it's so important for the audience and readers to understand how these stories come to life, how they even begin. I mean, and your origin story is a poetry, and also it has to do with art, because you're talking about light, you're talking about images, you're talking about fracture, which is so interesting, and we're going to get to that, because Antara is an artist, which I want to discuss, and I understand it now, given your background, why you wrote that part of the novel with such authority. But so Antara came to you first. Obvious. I mean, not obviously, even though it's told from Antara's voice, it doesn't mean that she was the one who came to you first, but she is obviously the one who came to you first. And then Tara was born out of Antara. Or how did Tara appear?
I think, if you go back all the way, 7 or 8 years, I think they appeared together. They kind of were born at the same moment. But I think with this draft, I was able to kind of start with Antara and have her be the entry point, because, I realized once I started this draft that all those other drafts that I had kind of kicked myself about and I had been so frustrated over, they were actually a very deep kind of preparation. And I didn't have the ability to see that while I was in the middle of writing them, because I think, you're aware of your word count and you're aware of time, and you're going on social media and you're looking at all these other writers coming out with their and it all seems so easy, and you feel like, oh, people are just like typing away and full of inspiration, and the muse is clearly visiting them every night. What about me?
That's a bunch of malarkey.
But that's really what it felt like to me. I actually never had that many writer friends. I did the fellowship at the University of East Anglia, so I had a couple of friends from there. But in a lot of ways, I feel like I wrote the book in the dark. Like, I was really alone, and especially after moving to Dubai, which is where I live now, the writing community here is really small, very nascent. There isn't much of a community to speak of, and even though they're trying to make all these grassroots efforts, it's kind of still at a very early stage. And so I just didn't have that kind of community. Yeah.
Writers need community badly. I don't think because novelists are so solitary. It's especially the first chunk, the first draft is alone. It's aloneness. Like, even if you have a family, and I know you have a young family and you're married, and but still that experience must have been very lonely. And so one of the things that struck me is how many different themes you're dealing with here. It's so many layers of themes. The one that really stood out for me, besides the mother daughter dynamic, which we will discuss, is the treachery of memory. And that just, you drove that home so beautifully, and it was so elegantly done, and it's layered like memory is. And so when you were discussing how Antara is this unreliable narrator, I feel like those are the best kinds. And and talk to me a little bit about that, the notion of the treachery of memory, because you start off with Tara. She starts off, you meet her when she's losing her memory, and then Antara, as a result, begins to unpack. That is, as we say in the screenwriting world, the inciting incident, so to speak. So tell me about how you worked into that, the notion of the treachery of memory, how it works, and the lies people tell themselves and others as a result.
Yeah, memory always was kind of an important theme for me, thinking about, my creative work. Even when I was working as a curator, I was fascinated by the idea of the archive. I read a lot of like Derrida, and I read just different thinking around the archival impulse, how that kind of informs the canon, how that canon is then colonized. And that really kind of was the centerpiece for a lot of my curatorial work. I was really inspired by curators one who is now deceased, like Okwi Enwezor, who just really opened my eyes about how deeply subjective memory is. And I'm still to this day really struck and disturbed by how much weight we put on memory. Like entire court cases and criminal cases are based on kind of eyewitness accounts of one individual who of course has their biases. And, people are sentenced to life in prison, sometimes sentenced to death based on these things. When we know that memory is kind of like very problematic. So that was a lot of my early interest. I curated a show actually around Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, which
mentioned that in Burnt Sugar. It's mentioned in Burnt Sugar, yes.
That the show in the novel is actually very loosely kind of based on my show, although I had a little fun with it and played around and kind of imagined into it. But when I read Marquez's work I think I was in my mid-20s, it just blew my mind. The way he handles the movement of history and the way amnesia continues to kind of carve away at what we remember about our pasts. I was just like blown away by it. And it continued to just be at the back of my mind when I started writing the book all those years ago. So memory was always an important part of the story. I think it took on a different kind of gravity for me personally when about 4 years ago, I think my grandmother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease.
Okay.
And suddenly memory was like my entire life was kind of, I felt broken open by that discovery. And suddenly I was faced with my grandmother having this illness that I knew nothing about. So I went deep into the research, not only looking at the kind of really Western paradigms of how they treat the symptoms, but also looking at these different healing modalities. I looked at Ayurveda, I looked at Chinese medicine.
And you put all of that in the novel, which I absolutely loved, when Antara was taking deep dives into figuring out how to heal her mother, or at least mitigate the symptoms. It was just beautifully expressed.
Well, it's funny because that's exactly, I was dealing with all this material that I had researched, and it kind of became a parallel between me and Antara. We're both dealing with this material that we've researched, and she puts it into her art. And I also put it into my art. I put it into my book.
Yeah.
That's a kind of deep parallel between the way both me personally and the character are dealing with this illness and the kind of the issues that arise around it, I suppose.
Now, did your family tell a lot of stories? Were you told stories? Did your nana, nani tell you stories about partition, about just family stories? And because I really got a sense that there was a lot of storytelling in your life. I don't know why. I don't know. Maybe because of the layers in this novel, but
You know what's so interesting? I wonder, I really think about that because on one hand, I think there was always so much conversation. For example, my mother's family, whenever we would go to Pune, my mother's family is full of women.
Uh,
And everybody would gather, and it would just, everyone was so it is to this day so close, and there was always so much to share, so much conversation, so much talking about what was happening, gossip as well, and it was always incredibly fun for me to
absolutely.
be there. But at the same time, I think it's interesting what happens when there's a child around. um, Suddenly there are a lot more silences than there would be because there are kind of parts of the story that are left out. And
Absolutely.
for me personally, I think there were a lot of those kind of moments where stories were left unfinished and where I would have questions and they were only partially answered. And that, for a very curious child, which I was, that left a lot of gaps in the narrative that I kind of, I think, took it upon myself to creatively fill. And I think that's one of the things that I do with my fiction writing. I look at the questions that are kind of still swirling in me, in my memory, and and I write into those, and that allows me to take things that might be based in some kind of version of reality into this imaginal space where I can really explore um, my fantasies. I can explore my fears and nightmares. And that's what, to me, is really exciting about fiction in particular.
So what I'm hearing from you is that your family does not resemble Antara or Tara's family, and I'm sure people have asked you many times, is this based on autobiography and so on, and I know it's not because I know you and we've talked about it, and or I've heard you talk about it, and so I think that's the way you capture the fracture and quite, I mean, the unhealthy dynamic between Tara and Antara is astonishing to me then because you haven't experienced this. So what was it about this kind of a dynamic between a mother and a daughter that made compelled you to write this story?
Hmm. You know, I find mother-daughter relationships really fascinating. I mean, I think for all of us, our relationship with our mother is kind of the first, most of us at least, that's kind of our first relationship, so it's in the womb, it's kind of that early connection. And then uh, there's this way in which, and I'm also really fascinated by something that Joseph Campbell says, which is that we're constantly, from the time we're children to the time we're adults, we're constantly enacting the drama of the nursery. And I think that kind of idea is very vivid and interesting to me. So, the other side of that, though, is that there are, of course, so many mother daughters in literature, but for me, it was really important to look at a different kind of relationship particularly because in the context of South Asian culture,
Yes.
um, overall, I think that the mother is kind of idealized in a particular kind of way.
Deified almost.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a tricky pedestal to be on. I think, there's very little space in which to discuss maternal ambivalence, in which to think about the ways in which mothers are humans, that they're complex people like everyone else, and that, and even just to look at these ideas that I think we take for granted, and I think we shouldn't, ideas like maternal instinct. What is that? And is that really something we should be assuming just exists? And that's such a, I think, it's such a strange burden to continue to put on women's shoulders. And it's
It's
one that I'm
oppressive.
surprised.
It's oppressive.
Yeah, and I don't think we talk about it enough. I
No.
don't think we discuss it enough, and I don't think we are open to looking at the dark side of motherhood.
Absolutely, because it's scary. People think it's going to shake the very societal firmament underneath our feet, and
Well,
that's
I think motherhood and the relationship with the mother is supposed to be that last like safe space or something. And I think what a ridiculous notion, like to have that kind of, again, have that oppressive notion around
put
motherhood.
on
I think
women.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So definitely that was something that was really important to me. And also a lot of people have said to me like, well, I don't understand Tara. I don't get what her motivations are.
I
And
understand her completely. I
well,
don't
I
love
just
her,
think
but I
it's so
understand her.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, listen, and I'm not saying, I've written Tara as a perfect character. I'm sure she
No.
has a lot of
Well, she's
issues
a
that I,
perfect antagonist. When we get to the craft talk, I want to. She's a brilliant antagonist for many reasons, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But please continue. Yeah.
yeah, no, but I mean, I think, it's often a question, I think a lot of times we lack an ability to have empathy for certain kinds of characters that we don't understand. And I've noticed mostly that's women, and particularly women that are not, likable in the sense that they're not just kind of sweet wallflowers, or they're not demure and submissive, or they're not falling into these categories of womanhood that we have, that have kind of been set in stone by the culture we live in. And the fact that Tara, and it's strange because there are these dark archetypes of motherhood. Like look at Kali, look at there are these
Yes.
extremely dark archetypes of motherhood. And for me, it was also that, but we choose not to look at them as kind of existing. We try not to ground them. Like we're okay at thinking about them in the realm of religion, but like how do we ground those? How do we find a place for those to actually exist? Like how do we allow women to be, I don't know, flesh and blood, three-dimensional humans?
Well, this is the thing about Thara. I mean, you actually you stated completely. Thara, I forget where we put it, but you just said it. Thara ran from anything that was oppressive. Marriage, diets. It didn't matter. Anything that she felt burdened by and suppressed by, she ran from.
Yeah.
That is an admirable quality, not a negative. That's my personal opinion. I didn't love Thara. She's cruel. She's narcissistic. So many things. But that impulse to run from anything that tries to pigeonhole her or oppress her or corner her is an admirable and heroic instinct. She didn't go about it the right way, in my opinion, but she did what she could to survive.
Yeah, and I think another thing worth always thinking about is what are the support structures that these women have? Like they have nothing, they have zero. And another thing I would point out is that, Antara has her issues, her own psychological issues. Tara has her own psychological issues, but they are not born in a vacuum.
No.
This is kind of intergenerational trauma that has been passed down. I mentioned the grandparents a few minutes ago, and unfortunately, the limitations of trying to write the kind of novel I wanted, have it be focused and sharp in the way that I wanted, didn't allow for a kind of sprawling story going back into the grandparents' generation. But I do mention at moments, what kind of a mother and father, what kinds of mother and father Tara grew up with. I mentioned the fact that the father had numerous affairs, the mother had numerous miscarriages, and there is a kind of bitterness and anger that Tara herself grew up with. We don't know the details of how she was perhaps as well neglected because of the difficulty that her parents were experiencing.
Well, when a young woman takes her child and runs away to an ashram, she's searching for something. I mean, that's undeniable. And was it the right decision? No, it probably wasn't. But it was at least a choice that she made.
And also, she probably, if she decided to go, if she was unhappy in her husband's house and she decided to go to an ashram, that probably meant that her parents' house was not open to her.
At 100%.
So, I mean, I think, it's easy to kind of blame Tara. And
Yeah,
I think, I've set up the situation, and it's always interesting for me to see what the reader brings to it. Are they only willing to blame Tara, and kind of everyone else seems, and
right.
it's interesting because some people are like, oh, but Tara's husband, Antara's father, he seems perfectly nice. And was the mother-in-law that bad? And it's interesting because people bring their own baggage and their own kind of
100%.
conditioning.
That's what I,
The
this
reading
book
of the
must have made, this story rather, must have made so many people so uncomfortable, which is fantastic. Because that's what we're supposed to do as writers, Avni. We're not supposed to make people feel like surrounded in bubble wrap with their, ideas that are not evolving. So, especially in a South Asian context, I think this story is far more important than people fully contemplate can fully contemplate or understand. Speaking of Nani, on page 33, I'm sorry I mutilated your, I marked so many notes and so many things because I had to. I won't be able to get to everything, but I wrote on page 33, when Nani is talking about her daughter, Tara, Antara's mother, and she says, she's become so fat, your mother. Her knuckles are swollen to double what they were. How will we pry the jewelry off her hands when she dies? And I just wrote, yikes. And I got the first, I went, oh boy. No, of course, Tara didn't happen in a vacuum. That's impossible.
Yeah. I mean, if that's any indication for a mother's first reaction to her daughter having like a degenerative, life-threatening
Yeah,
disease, is
that
how are we going to get the jewelry off her fingers? I mean, that tells you the
yes,
kind of mother that she grew up with and the kind of father that she grew up with,
absolutely. And then, of course, there was this whole section of when they returned from the ashram. The homelessness section was harrowing for me. I was just picturing them in front of the club gates day after day, and it was just it was so devastating. And then they get then Antara's father deposits them in at her grandparents' house, and all you hear Antara remembers is that her mother is locked in the room with her grandparents, and they're just yelling at her, just yelling at her. This poor woman has been through so much, and instead of trying to understand what motivated her to do such a thing, they're just re-traumatizing her. That's the way I felt.
And I think there is a kind of their version and their narrative, don't forget, was probably also spoon fed to Antara. And that was so, even Antara's own understanding of her mother, and the reason why I think in a lot of ways she has trouble feeling compassion to for her mother, it's because she was also kind of to some degree brought up in the house of her grandparents. And
I have no compassion for that.
there was a kind of that must have, that yelling that was happening in the room, that must have traveled out. She could probably hear and understand what was happening, and that her mother had clearly done something very bad, and that her mother was clearly a terrible villain.
Yeah.
And for children, I think it's children are so intuitive, but I think it's also, like things can sometimes seem very black and white. If your mother is being ostracized, she must be bad.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like if everyone is ostracizing your mother, then there must be something very wrong.
If your grandmother, her mother is ostracizing your mother, that means your mother did something very wrong. Absolutely.
And a child's own kind of impulse is to find alliances. And I think, she found it so difficult to have an alliance with her mother. And so she tries to look for allies in her grandparents as well. And so for me, I actually came to the story I came to the writing of the story with zero judgment for these characters.
Yes.
I absolutely, I kind of, for me, I felt like I was watching their stories come to life in front of me, and there was no judgment. It was just sort of happening because based on the circumstances, there is like a cause and an effect. And for me, that's what I'm really interested in with these characters and with the decisions they make. What is the cause and what is the effect?
Absolutely. Especially your antagonists or your anti-heroes, you can't judge them, because if you judge them, they're going to come off one-dimensional on the page. There's absolutely no way. So that's the thing. It's just, that was the thing about Tara. As I said to you earlier, she's the perfect antagonist because she mirrors the protagonist. Antara, which the names Tara, Antara, perfect, subtle, beautiful. And Tara talks about it. You know, she named, or does Tara talk about it, or Antara, that she named her daughter anti me, basically, you know, but they're not, they're mirrors of each other, which they would be because of the multi-generational trauma that has trickled down. But Dara is the perfect antagonist because she is both sympathetic and reprehensible, because you see yourself in her, you see others in her, because I found myself weaving in and out of compassion to repulsion to, once again, to a greater understanding of human nature. And this is as a woman who is a mother myself, and have had moments while being a mother of not feeling so motherly, of feeling kind of exhausted, like, how can I continue to do this? And also resisting the notion of being defined by motherhood. Like, this is my identity. I really, really related to Thara. And
I just
I think
think
that's
it's
really important.
so, you know what's so interesting to me? I've had these conversations with mothers just over the course of my life. And it's like, they'll say things to me like, but now that you've had children, can't you just not imagine what it would be like without them? And again, this to me is just such a kind of limited perspective on what it means to exist in the world. It to me, it looks like a kind of lack of imagination,
Mhm.
a lack of empathy, maybe even a kind of fear, um, to really question the decisions you've made. I don't know. Like, I find that whole idea so bizarre. I mean, absolutely, I can imagine what my life would be like without
Absolutely.
children.
Me
I
too.
can absolutely imagine what that. I remember very clearly what my life was before having children, and
Yes.
children were not the end all and be all of my life trajectory. And so, you know, I just I sometimes find the conversations that we end up having around being mothers, with mothers themselves,
Very
actually, more
important.
than women who have decided not to have children. With mothers themselves, I find these conversations to be kind of so narrow,
Mhm.
in a way that I don't find to be really generative. And the other thing, you know, that I've been thinking about a lot, is that it's worth kind of expanding this notion of what it means to be a mother,
100.
and what are the limitations of this word mother, and why do we have to look at it through such a narrow lens? Why can't we expand what the word motherhood means? I don't feel, I think that by kind of being so protective of the parameters of motherhood, I find that mothers themselves are probably doing themselves a disservice. I mean,
Absolutely.
they're just kind of my
As
own.
women, as women, as people, as productive members of society, they're doing themselves a tremendous disservice. But I could imagine that the South, did you get a lot of pushback from South Asian writers specifically about the idea that an Indian or a South Asian mother could be so toxic? Did you get, did people say this is not realistic, or because I think it's extremely realistic.
I think a lot of people told me they couldn't empathize with Tara. They couldn't feel any empathy for Tara. And
Let's
I
do that.
wonder if some part of it that is that they just couldn't even imaginatively go there, go to that place that Tara had gone. Maybe there's just, you know, I think a lot of times, especially with things, with ideas like motherhood that are kind of so idealized, where women are deified, mothers are deified, I think we split off from these negative associations and ideas in a way that like makes us kind of crazy. You know,
Yeah.
it makes us kind of internally split in a deep way. I think in terms of South Asian writers, no, I think across the board, it's been a mixed bag. You know, I think people have had people from everywhere, to be honest with you, have had very strong reactions to the book, very strong positive reactions and very strong negative reactions,
That's
very strong.
excellent. That's excellent. I'm so glad to hear that, both, because
Yeah.
like I said, it makes you uncomfortable, and that's exactly what you're supposed to be doing. You know, uh And I think that's why Tara, the more I think about her, the more I actually empathize with her. Not
Yeah.
I'm evolving with her. Like I'm feeling, because you know why I think people don't empathize with Tara is because they're too afraid to face the truth in themselves. Because Tara is a mirror to many, many of us. Even the mothers who absolutely love being mothers, who've always wanted to be mothers, they have dark moments, and Tara is a reflection of that, maybe to an extreme, but I think that's where it comes from. You said
Really
something about, yes, go ahead, go ahead.
No, I was saying I really love the fact that you're saying that you're kind of evolving with her and with
Yes,
the reading of her, because for me, I wanted to write a book that people would be thinking, once you read it, that you would continue to kind of think about it, and
yes.
that your mind might change. I mean, some books that I read growing up, I mean, to be honest, thinking of, the most famous unreliable narrator, when I read Lolita, I
Yep.
hated it so much. I just was so, I found it so difficult. I think I was in the 10th, no, I think I was in the 10th grade maybe when I read it. And
That's
I
really young. That's really,
was
that's a,
traumatized. Yeah,
yeah.
I was traumatized. And that it was only much later that I kind of returned to it and then started to think through it and started to think through what Nabokov had done, and how he had been able to um, create someone who was who was a criminal, who was just a
Repugnant.
repulsive human being,
I know.
who you would just want to run from, and at the same time was able to kind of marry such a character with this beautiful style and language, and just the idea of these things coming together. I mean, that just really stayed with me in a way, and I kept returning to it at various moments in my life. And I think that idea of something being really difficult and really hard, but at the same time being compelling is fascinating to me. Like, what is the intersection of those two things, and what is it like to sit and stand in that place when it comes to contemplating a work of art?
Speaking of beautiful lines, there was a few lines that I underlined here, but my favorite line is on page 88 at the bottom of the page. And it's talking about, Antara is talking about when she left the ashram. So I just want to read it because I just love it. By the time we left the ashram, it was 1989. I was 7 years old. Sometimes I can feel that girl crowning at the back of my throat, trying to come out through any orifice she can. But I swallow her until the next time she wants to be born again. That's gorgeous. That's just poetry. It's painful, but it's beautiful, and it's so elegant because it's about birth, crowning the back of my throat. I mean, it's just so masterful. And there's many other beautiful lines, but that one really stuck out for me. So I want to talk about the men a little bit. Reza Pine.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm thinking about him. I'm still processing Reza. So Reza is, I'm going to do spoilers. Hopefully everybody, you've already read the novel, and hopefully this will entice you to read the novel even if you haven't. But I have to talk about Reza Pine. Reza Pine is initially Tara's lover. He was with them for a long time, right?
Yeah,
6 years.
for quite a few years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he ghosts them, he disappears, which I was not remotely shocked by because he always had one foot out the door. And you beautifully kind of introduced that, his sort of one foot in, one foot out. But then Antara, who she had the hots for him, that was, you foreshadow again, you plant that seed beautifully. So I wasn't completely shocked when she ends up having an affair with him later. But I want to understand why. I think I do understand why, but I want to hear it from you. Is this spitting in Tara's eye? Is
I
this
think
about daddy? What is this about?
I mean, I think there's a deep element of revenge. I think there's a deep desire to embody her mother, even while she destroys her mother. And I
Yeah.
think being with Reza was a way to kind of accomplish both simultaneously. Do I think she was completely consciously aware of what she was doing? No, I think she, ran into him at an art event and one thing led to another. And she probably wasn't kind of sitting too deeply in the knowledge of exactly what she was doing. But I do think that there is a kind of deep subconscious desire for her to do those two things, to
Yes.
be her mother and destroy her mother at the same
And
time.
it made complete sense. And it was done again so elegantly. It wasn't melodramatic, and it wasn't unexpected. So that was masterful. I don't know how I feel about Dilip.
Yeah.
I have to say, I like Thara much more than I like Dilip.
Yeah. I
And
think Dilip is one of those characters. For me also, it's very interesting because some people are just like, oh, the only nice character in the book is Antara's husband. And then other people are just like, oh my God, he's so terrible and bland. And he's kind of like this like silent misogynist. And like there are all these other kind of
I didn't
qualities.
think he was remotely bland. I don't think Dilip is bland. I think he's
Right.
passive aggressive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Passive aggressive people are not bland.
It's interesting to see what people kind of see in him, because I think I was very, writing Dilip was interesting for me because I wanted to not say too much about him. I wanted him to exist, but I wanted some of the contours to be kind of left unmarked. And I wanted the reader to read into him a little bit. I think he's kind of, for me, that kind of interesting character where, like, what do you feel about that nice, maybe kind of liberal, kind of normal, everyday, Desi man? What do we think about him? Like, how is he participating in Antara's oppression, and like how are we giving him a kind of free pass? And so to some degree I think Dilip can kind of offer a way to mirror back to the reader some of their own questions and some of their own assumptions, I guess, around what's acceptable for, like, to me, I agree with you. I think Dilip has a kind of way of manipulating
100%.
Antara, and he has a way of asserting power in ways that are kind of difficult for her to like pinpoint. You can see that she's kind of struggling with the way he kind of dominates her and then pulls back. And so there's this like strange power dance that's happening between them. And some readers don't pick up on that at all.
So the line that clued me in was, I'm paraphrasing, but he says to her, I like the idea of you being home all day.
Yeah.
I was like, red flags, ding, 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 ding. What? And what? Mr. Modern, Mr. America, he wants his Indian wife at home all day? I mean, what's that all
about? Some people read that as sweet.
No. I read that I read
some
that.
People have told me that. Some people have said that's so sweet. He like doesn't care if she works. I'm like,
no.
For me, it's fascinating to see how some things, like how we kind of how we allow for these kinds of behaviors, and how we kind of decide that these certain things are acceptable. Or it's just kind of considered it's fine for him to behave like that. Mm-hmm. Or then people almost make excuses for his behavior.
Yeah, I took that as Dilip is going to be a problem. That's what and then he does this thing, as you mentioned, where he dominates and then pulls back, which is a form of gaslighting. And he doesn't fully gaslight her because that Antara is too smart. Like she would pick up on that very quickly. But he does it in such a way that is so stealthy. He betrays her. I feel this is all subjective. I feel he betrays her emotionally with Tara. There are moments where because Tara is constantly accusing Antara of being a liar, which is another theme that I found really fascinating. To the point where, and Antara is accusing her mother of being a liar. So somebody is lying at any given point. They're both lying, but they both don't know. They're so many interesting things are happening, and Dilip turns to, and I knew he was going to do this because I've seen this happen in front of me. He turns to her and he sort of softly accuses Antara, his wife, of lying. Like he picks up where Tara leaves. So that was incredibly interesting.
And the other interesting thing about Dilip that I think people forget is that Dilip himself lied. Like he's kind of the first liar in the book because he tells his mother that, oh, actually Tara's a widow.
You're absolutely right. That's why he's like so focused on this lying business. He's projecting.
And that's why he's also, and that's another way in which you see he's kind of manipulating the situation.
Absolutely, yes.
He's kind of, playing both sides, and he's telling his mother one thing, telling Antara and Tara another thing, and it's only when they get together that everything comes to the surface. So,
is Antara obsessive compulsive a little bit?
I don't know if she would be diagnosed, but maybe she's somewhere on that spectrum.
Her categorizing things, putting things in neat little boxes. I mean, it's a form of control, obviously. Because she's had control and power wrested from her from such a young age.
Again, I was like trying to stay far from the judgment, so I was never like diagnosing my characters.
That's up to us.
Yeah,
boy, that's our decision. We readers.
Except of course for Tara in terms of her Alzheimer's,
that's different.
The doctors diagnosed, but in terms of this is something Antara does, and I don't place. I never through the writing was like, oh, she's clearly like when I was thinking about her as a character, and this is another thing that for me is part of the way I think about my characters is I don't kind of decide like she's going to have this issue or this illness or she's going to have these kind of anxieties because I don't necessarily know that when we meet people in real life that's how we meet them. I think we meet them as a kind of holistic individual.
Absolutely. So I'm just wondering, so many people in Antara's life, like Purvi, for instance, almost so many people are so unkind to Antara. She doesn't seem to have massive reactions to it until the very end. I mean, with the having given birth and hormones and so many different things come to a head. But like I was thinking about Purvi and this was her friend. And for a minute I felt like, oh, she has a friend. But no, Purvi undermines her a lot in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I also question why Antara decides to even be friends with Purvi and her husband. What is Antara's motivations in that? I mean, they're kind of like a little more upper crust. They're fancy. They travel here and there. They have like houses and estates and horses and whatever. And so and Antara does like to go to these parties where drugs are served on trays and stuff like that. So, there is that side of Antara, which I think also comes from the fact that she has experienced a kind of abject poverty and that kind of lack with her mother. And so she is looking for a kind of security, and sometimes it's at the cost of herself, like even with Dilip, it's a kind of, I think a lot of that is a cry and a search for security, wanting to be a member of this club where she was like a beggar outside of, like where
I know it's incredible.
She kind of experienced cruelty at the gate of that club. She wants to be an insider. And so there is this kind of insider outsider anxiety in her that she's kind of always grappling with.
Absolutely. So the ending, Can we talk just very briefly?
Or-
So I sat there, I closed the book, and this is why you know not when a story is successful, because I closed the book and I just sort of sat there. And I was like, okay, she goes back. She leaves barefoot, buys a cigarette, or she gets one for free. And she just has left her child and Purvi, all the characters are now in her space. Dilip's mother, everybody. And what is she experiencing when she goes back? She goes back for her daughter?
Um, I would say, so this is my, first of all, this whole idea that she leaves, I think is also a question, right? Like she definitely, like she seems to go downstairs in the elevator and everything, but then when she takes that walk,
Mm-hmm.
she kind of makes, it might be that she made a circle, it might not be, she might have actually been in the same place, but kind of traveled in her mind. I think by that point in the book, we realize, especially with the scene upstairs in the apartment, we realize that this person is really psychologically broken. Because yeah, like there, you know, that scene is also supposed to kind of be a question mark. Is Tara actually sick? Is Antara actually the one who's crazy? What is happening? So I think there's really a kind of disintegration that takes place between mother and daughter at that point, but also internally to Antara. And so she goes for this walk and comes back, or maybe she stays in the same place. And then, as you said, she goes back up to the apartment. But you know, it always struck with me. I read Portrait of a Lady. It always stayed with me, rather. I read Portrait of a Lady when I was like a senior in high school. And I remember I was having this conversation with this teacher, and she said, well, why do you think Isabel Archer goes back? Mm-hmm. And I was like, I don't know. She's a masochist. She's crazy. She's married to this disgusting man and she goes back. Like, he's abusive. She's masochistic. And my teacher just laughed and she was like, okay, that's valid. I was like, why? You know, what do you think it is? And she was like, well, she wants to be good. She wants to be thought of as good. Mm-hmm. And for me, I don't think, even in her madness, I don't think that Antara has broken free of the social pressure and the societal expectation, perhaps in a way that Tara was able to. And you can say, in a sense, if you compare the way Tara was able to escape, but the way that Antara is trapped, you can say in a way that Tara was actually able to do something that Antara wasn't. Maybe she was even braver. You know, like I don't know. That to me is also something, I don't know the full answer to that, but for me, it just felt like the true ending of the story. It just felt that this person would not leave. No matter what. She is, as much as she and Tara are the same, she's also not Tara, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
And she, the way Tara could walk away knowing nothing, having nothing. Antara is tied to her life and her comforts in a different way. I think she, you know, in a sense, and this is the interesting paradox maybe at the heart of the ending. In a sense, she tied herself to all these things as a kind of security and as a life raft after the childhood she had. But now you can see she might have to kind of go down with the ship because she's tied herself too tightly.
So it's so interesting. So you've presented a character who doesn't necessarily evolve, and you've done it in a way that, you know, that formula, that classical story thing, that the arc of the character, she has to change. But I was not left feeling dissatisfied, and I did not feel that there was stasis. I didn't feel like Antara was stagnant, even though she went back. I did not feel stagnation. So that is incredible, actually, because she didn't actually, she does the opposite of her mother. She doesn't take any chances, and so she actually doesn't change because she's broken, and broken people to change, it's very difficult.
Yeah, I think, you know, I don't know, I get the feeling, you know, as much as the trauma I think is going to continue, like I don't think that you can just totally outgrow or heal from your trauma. I don't know that her relationship with her daughter is the same as Tara's relationship was with her. You know, she does seem to be attached to her daughter in a particular way. Yes, she suffers from postpartum depression. Yes, she um, is dealing with other things, but there seems to be some kind of affection, something there,
It is
right?
different. It's markedly different. So in that sense, there's evolution.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, but Avni, this has been incredible. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful reading your novel and learning about Tara and Antara. And I just want to ask you, what is next for you? Are you working on anything new now? A new novel or?
Yeah, I've just started book number 2. It's such an like early moment for the
Sure.
book. I'm not talking about it too much because sometimes
No,
I
of
feel
course not. Yes.
the energy that
Yeah.
accumulates around the book, you can't talk about it too much. But yeah, it's going to be another novel for sure.
Excellent.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much for being with us, Avni. Um, Date with an Author, an author's live is made possible through the support of the Greenwich Library Board of Trustees and contributions by generous donors. Burnt Sugar is available for checkout in print and digital formats at the Greenwich Library and available for purchase at Diane's Books in Greenwich. Please call them at 203 869 1515 to order your copy. Thanks for watching.